So as I said, we are looking at the character of Esther tonight. If you don't know anything about Esther's story, I'm excited for you to hear it. If you know a little bit about her story, I'm excited for you to hear it. It's packed. There's so much that happens. It's fun. It's exciting. And actually, I was just thinking this as I got up here. We usually try to follow along in the book, right? Open your Bible, open your phone. This is going to move really fast, and there's a lot of scripture references. So I would actually encourage you, focus here, and don't pretend you're looking at it on your phone. Like, actually put your phone away. Because you don't want to miss it. Seriously, there's so much that happens, you don't want to miss it. So get ready. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information first, and then like I said, we're going to jump right in to verse 1 of the chapter. So Esther is a book that's somewhat controversial because it doesn't mention God in the book. In the 10 chapters, if you look at every single word, God is not in it. His name is not there. You won't find it. And so it's kind of controversial because people wonder, well, why is it in the Bible then? And we don't know the answer. And I guess it's one of those things where I would hope that we could learn as we go through this that it's okay we don't know and God knows, and that's the way he wanted it written. Even though the name isn't in there, you can see his fingerprints everywhere. And as I was looking at this, I realized, isn't that what our lives are like? We don't look up in the sky and see the airplane writing, God was here, God is here. Right? We don't hear our phone go off in the morning to our alarm and it's God's voice saying, wake up, good morning. Those physical evidences don't exist as much as we want them to. I would love to have God literally standing right here, telling me the words and, this telephone thing. But that's not how it works. He's invisible. So as we go through this story, I hope that you can kind of notice that. It takes faith to notice God in our world. Okay? Because we can't see it, because Jesus isn't physically there. So this book, among many other things, it has taught me more about that faith in God being in every story. When I started studying Esther, I realized it has all the pieces of a modern day drama series. So if they were going to make it into a movie, right? I'm picturing this, the previews, with all the music and stuff. I mean, there's a beautiful heroine, right? And that's Esther. She's courageous. There's an evil villain. You're going to meet him pretty quickly. There's irony, there's suspense, there's extravagance, there's humor. All of this stuff is in this tiny book. And again, that's why I say, pay attention, listen, read along with me. And I think you'll find it almost like hearing a movie go. And parts of it too, I mean, depending on who might direct the movie, it'd probably be kind of a rated R sort of thing. There's some things that are going to surprise you. And again, look for God. Think about how he's in it, even though it's difficult. The action doesn't stop, and in all of it, like I said, God's in every action. And as I kept studying it, I found that so fascinating and so encouraging, because we can easily forget when we get bogged down, and we can say, where's God? And this story reminds me that he's always there. So a quick bit about the setting and some of the characters before we go in. The book of Esther begins around 483 BC. That's about 500 years before Jesus comes. So we're before Jesus comes. Esther actually happens to be an orphan. She's an orphan girl who is part of a large Jewish community who was exiled from their home. So if you're familiar with all the times that Israel didn't obey God, and then they got in trouble, and then God forgave them, that whole cycle, okay? This is during one of those cycles. They were exiled and stuck, right, until a king gave them permission to return. So at this point, King Cyrus had given some of the Jews permission to return to their homeland, but Esther was still among Jews that were still there. So they're not back home yet. Okay. It actually, if you're into like history and stuff, the book of Esther and the timeline, it actually takes place in the middle of Ezra, and Ezra was one of the leaders that took Israelites back. So it's cool to see how the pieces fit. So again, that's the setting. 5 characters I want you to keep track of. Esther is obviously the first one. She's an orphan, she's Jewish, and she is being raised by her cousin Mordecai. Okay, so that's character number 2. Mordecai is her cousin. We don't know how she became an orphan. We don't know what happened to her parents. We're not given that information, just that she's being raised by her cousin. You will also meet King Ahasuerus and Queen Vashti. They're the kind of ones in charge at this point. And the last character to pay attention to, his name's Haman. Haman is the evil villain in this plot, okay? So, I'm just going to start off with a chunk of this. Verse 1 in chapter 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when he sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. So he's thrown a party for all of his people, okay? The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So if you didn't catch that, he threw a party for himself for 180 days. You go to school 180 days. He's saying, look at how great I am. I'm throwing a party for myself for 180 days. Sound like fun? Right? That's his character. Verse 5, when those days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days. So his first big party was for his people, right? His servants, his army, his people. Then he says, okay, now for the next 7 days, everybody can join us. The whole kingdom, okay? A feast for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and so on and so on. And it's describing all this extravagant stuff. Golden couches of gold and silver, precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels. Royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. In other words, drink as much as you want. That's what they're there for, okay? For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So that's how the book opens. It's just this big, crazy party, right? 180 days, drink whatever you want. 7 more days, all these other people join in. Extravagance, just out of control. So to me, like the stage is set for something bad to happen. Like this isn't a good atmosphere. So we're going to continue in verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded, and this list of men are his servants, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So this, few verses is exactly what you're thinking it is. We could spend a lot of time here, but to make it quick, basically the king says, "O queen, come to me and all my drunken friends and show yourself off to us." Right? That's his invitation to her. And I would say, this is not good. Often our world spews images of that kind of stuff at us, and we get like desensitized to the way things should be, right? This is not a good thing that the king has just done. And I would say the only good thing in this little situation is that the queen said no. And just one quick bit of advice here, ladies in the room, make sure the word no is in your vocabulary. This is not a flattering invitation to her, right? You might be thinking, oh man, she'll get all this attention. They want to see her. No. Okay, this is not a good thing, okay? Your body is not for show, and that's what he's implying here, okay? And I would also say, like, ladies and gentlemen in the room, if you're a believer in Jesus, right, your body belongs to him, like, it does. And to honor that is such a gift. So I take from that little snippet there just the reminder that the way God designed our bodies and the ways we can honor him with our bodies, and this little situation isn't a real good example. So God's picture of this really is that the only person that should have that sort of intimate view or relationship is your husband or your wife. And again, our society gets this really confused because, like, people will, like, send pictures and do really, really stupid stuff that really just ends badly. So just keep that in your head there. Anyways, Vashti refuses. She says no, and the king is upset. He's embarrassed because his wife just, like, put him down in front of all his buddies. And the king kicks her out. He says, okay, you said no, so you're no longer the queen. So exit Vashti. That's all we hear of Vashti in the whole story. At this point, some time goes by, but eventually the king decides he's going to have a beauty pageant to find a new queen. That's his plan, okay? So in chapter 2, we're going to pick up and hear this idea about how he should solve this problem about his queen leaving. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So again, here's the part where it's like, is this really what I'm thinking it is? Yeah, it is. They went out and collected beautiful young women, innocent young women, for this contest, right? Again, this is like, is this the Bible we're reading? Like, is this really the story? These women did not volunteer for this. They were victims. And it makes me think of, like, today's, like, The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, how, like, people volunteer for those shows, they want to be on them. Like, this is not that. They went and gathered them. They were taken. It actually says in verse 8, so when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, Esther also was taken to the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. She was not, like, out there like, me, like, I can win. Take me to the palace. I want to be the queen, right? This is not. No, she was taken along with hundreds of other innocent women. So this is another part I kind of just want to pause because, like I said, so far this story doesn't sound like God is in it, right? There's this big, extravagant, drunken party at the beginning, lots of inappropriateness, disrespect, people being treated wrongly. But sometimes it's like that in this world, right? And we cannot possibly see how God could be involved in these terrible things that happen. These women, it describes this and it says they went through a beautifying process for a year in the palace before they could go to the king. Right? There's so many words that could describe that. Then that whole process went by. Then they could sleep with him. Then they could see who pleased him the most. right? This is, where's God in this? What's going on? In verse 14, it describes this. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. This is not right or good or sacred or honorable. Nonetheless, in the end, Esther wins. Esther wins the favor of the king, and she becomes the queen. Here's what I want you to remember at this point, and this is the first point on your map. God's plans are not hindered when the events of the world are sick. To doubt his control is to draw boundaries around his sovereignty. I know I myself struggle a lot when you see horrible things happen and you get that feeling like, man, like, is this true? Like, does God really exist, right? But somehow you have to train your brain and pray to God to trust. He is always in control. He's never in a box. His plans are never hindered no matter what is happening. And that could be in your own life. That could be in something you see somewhere else. You don't want to put God in a box, right? It limits him, and God has no limits. So at this point in the story, too, it's good to remember that this world has a lot of victims in it. You actually might be one. You could be a victim of bullying, gossip, abuse, slander, right? When people talk badly about you. There could be trouble in your home life, right? Nothing is perfect in this world. It's a condition of the fall. But even in these disturbing events, God is at work. Horrible things happen, not because God is absent, but because people are sinful. It's always a good thing to check yourself with. Horrible things happen not because God is absent, but because people are sinful. God uses these things for good and his glory. And we've seen this in a lot of the characters Dave has looked at. It's kind of been a repeated theme, okay? So to that point, your second point on your map is this: don't lose hope because of what you see or because of something you've been through. Remember that God works in ways you can't see. God works in ways you can't see. So, while this contest is happening, okay, there's some things happening with this other character named Mordecai. So we're going to leave Esther in the palace and hop over and see what Mordecai is up to. Mordecai, remember, is Esther's cousin. He's the one who's raising her. So she was taken from him, right, to go to the palace to this contest. Before she left, Mordecai gave her two pieces of advice. Okay. One of them was to not tell them that she was Jewish. Okay. And the other one was to not ask for any special favors or special treatment. Okay, that was his advice. It seems like he was raising her in the knowledge of the Lord and in the promises of God that the Jewish people knew. And he cares. So as the story unfolds, he finds himself a lot at the gate of the palace, right? Trying to figure out how Esther is, how's she doing, what's going on, right? So that's what's happening with Mordecai. In chapter 2, there's another little snippet of an event that happens with Mordecai that I want to make sure we catch. It starts in verse 21. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So they want to kill the king. They want to assassinate him. This came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai basically foiled a plot that would have killed the king, right? He found out these two guys were planning this. He told Esther, Esther told the king. It was recorded in a book, kind of like of the events of the kingdom, okay? And then it just jumps to the next part of the story. This little snippet is going to be important later, and it's funny because I wanted to write it down, and I wrote it on a napkin so I wouldn't forget. Mordecai foils the assassination. Remember that, because it's going to come back, okay? Something else about Mordecai is that since he's a Jew, he refuses to bow down to any of the palace's authorities. And this includes this guy named Haman, right? So here enters this other character. Haman is an officer to the king, and Haman has a very big ego. It was expected there that everyone should bow down to the superiors, and when Haman walked by Mordecai, Mordecai never bowed to him. So this made Haman mad. Mordecai's allegiance was only to God, and he didn't break that because of the palace rules. So this filled Haman with fury. Okay. In chapter 3, this little instance happens. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. So Haman's like, this guy makes me mad. He's not bowing to me. So we're going to kill every single Jew in this place. All of them. Extermination, right? Genocide. That's his plan. So he hatches this plan in his evil little head, and he goes to the king. This is how he talks the king into it. He says, okay, if we kill all the Jews and plunder all their stuff, think how much money we could add to your treasury. That's his plan, right? So he goes to the king, and the king, oh yeah, sure, why not, right? The king has no conscience either. So he says, sure. We can kill all the Jews and take all their stuff. So they wrote up a letter. They wrote up an edict. Letters were sent to all the provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, and to plunder their goods. So here's another just like sickening sort of event that's going to happen. And I think to myself, why? Like, why is God letting all this stuff go on? But anyways, it keeps rolling. The word gets out about these letters. The Jews hear what's going to happen to them. And here's an example of how they feel. This is Mordecai, chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out in the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. She wants to figure out what's going on. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that it might show Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So, this plan is out there. Mordecai, I can't even imagine what this would be like. And then he tells this servant, Hathach, hey, tell Esther this is what's going on. And maybe Esther can go change the king's mind. Right? That's his hope. So Hathach takes the message to Esther. And Esther, her first response is basically, if I try to go talk to the king, he could just kill me. At that time, the laws in the palace were such that unless the king summoned you, you couldn't go talk to him, even the queen. So her first response is, well, I can't just go in and say, hey, what are you doing? You can't do this to my people. Plus, she wasn't supposed to tell him she was a Jew, right? So initially she's like, I don't think that I can do that. And right here in the story, you could call this sort of a climax. There's a lot of like building tension, bad things happening, conflict. Mordecai responds to Esther, and actually this whole message could have been about Mordecai as a hero of faith as well. I'm going to focus more on Esther at the end, but his response here it's amazing. In all of his sadness over this declaration that all of his people were going to be slaughtered, Mordecai remained convinced that God wouldn't allow it. He knew God's promises, that the Jews would not be wiped from the earth. He knew that, and he trusted it. And he replies to Esther's first response, and this is directly from the scripture. He says, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." This is like one of those verses that's like the splashy one where people remember it and it's written on things and pillows and stuff, for such a time as this, right? He's basically telling her, right, we're looking at the extermination of all of our people, everyone. And she's kind of in a lose-lose. He's like, you're going to die either way, Esther. You're a Jew, right? If you go into the king and he kills you, you're going to die. If you don't go into the king, he's going to kill all the Jews, you're going to die. He's like, God's plan's going to happen regardless. And additionally, he says, if you don't do anything, it'll come from somewhere else, because I trust God. Mordecai's so trusting in that. So he says, Esther, you are where you are for a reason. And that's another one of those statements that's sort of like we hear it all the time. It's kind of cliche, like you're where you are for a reason, but it's true. All the time. Right now in this room, you are where you are for a reason. So Mordecai has this sort of defining moment of faith in his speech, and now it's Esther's turn to respond again. And this is sort of another one of those moments that's like, wow, like, listen to this. She replies this time to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So she's gonna try it. Esther decides that it's worth the risk of her life to save her people. She puts others first, and she puts God first. This part kind of made me stop and think a little bit, because so this is the end of chapter 4. And chapter 5 starts, and there's actually a gap of 3 days. So like that little, it's funny, I think about white space a lot, like it's empty space, but again, like God's always doing something. So between the action in the word, chapter 4, chapter 5, there's 3 days. And you know what's happening here is they're fasting. Esther is taking time to figure out how to approach the king. She's not in a hurry. And this fasting, we always think of food, but really, and I try to think of it in my life, is, okay, how can I take away all distractions? What can I fast from to focus on God? So she's eliminating distractions, maybe eliminating comforts of her life. And I think, man, I wish we could all be like Esther here, right? And this could be like a whole other message. Like, she's seeking wisdom before acting. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I was in her case, I'd be like, all these people are going to die. I have to go to him now. Like, I have to talk to him now, right? But no, fast for 3 days. And she does that. And after the 3 days, then we get to chapter 5. And she enters the king's court. Verse 2, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So this means she's allowed to talk to him. He said it's okay. Now again, here's another thing where Esther's like really patient, because instead of requesting at that moment and telling, her side of what's happening, she says, how about you come to a banquet that I'm going to prepare for you and for Haman tonight? That's her invitation to the king. And again, it's like, what? What are you doing, Esther, right? But we keep reading, okay? And so that night, Haman and the king come to this banquet, right? They eat, they drink, they have a good time. And she still didn't say anything at the banquet either. And it's like, what? Why? Like, what's going on, right? Question only God can answer, and here luckily this time we're going to find out. So while this is happening here, Haman, his ego is getting puffed up a little bit more, because he's like, man, Esther's invited me to these banquets, and it's just me and the king and Esther. Like, he's feeling real good about himself. But every time he walks by Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't bow, he just gets angrier and angrier and angrier. And it just so happens that when he leaves that first banquet, he walks by the gate and Mordecai's there and doesn't bow. Right? So he gets mad again. Part of this chapter says, yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He let his anger completely control everything. That could be a whole other message, okay? So he's angry, and he gets home. His wife and all his friends said to him, let's hang Mordecai. Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully to the king to the next feast. Good plan. So that night, Haman builds a gallows to hang Mordecai. That same night, the king could not sleep. And I love this because it's like this random, ordinary life detail that's in the Bible. I mean, literally, it says, the king couldn't sleep and he wanted a bedtime story. Like, really. He couldn't sleep, so he called on his servants to read him a bedtime story. And because the stories they had at that time were the books of their history, right? The servant goes and pulls out a book. What story do you think he read to him? I know you can't see it. A little while ago, we heard about how Mordecai foiled the plot of the kids that were going to assassinate the king. They wrote it in the book. That's the book the servant pulled out. And the servant read this to the king. Hey, did you know that Mordecai saved your life a while back? And the king is like, oh, no, did we do anything to honor this guy? And they're like, no, we didn't. So that night, the king decides, I need to honor Mordecai in the morning. The same night that Haman says, I'm going to hang Mordecai in the morning. I mean, seriously, who comes up with this stuff? So that's what's happening, okay? Chapter 6 is the next morning, and Haman comes into the king, and the king says, and if you love irony and poetic justice and that type of stuff in stories, you're gonna like this. Haman came in and said, the king said to Haman, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? So the king's like, I want to honor somebody. What should I do? And of course, Haman, being the big-headed guy that he is thinking, the king must want to honor me. Awesome. So he says to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn. Let the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman says, this guy should be given the robes, the crown, the horse, and one of your officials should lead him through the town, showing him off, right? You know what's going to happen with this, right? Haman was not going to hang Mordecai the next morning, right? Or that morning. Haman was going to be dressing Mordecai in the king's robes, putting on the king's crown, putting him on the horse, and leading him through the city, telling everyone how great he was. Right? This man who Haman hates. I mean, people say that saying, you know, what goes around comes around, it's karma and all that stuff. It's not. It's God. It's God's power. It's God's. He has a sense of humor, I think, right? And it's just awesome how that comes the whole way around. I mean, and seriously, a bedtime story? And that's what makes all this happen? The king couldn't sleep? It just so happened the king couldn't sleep? And it just so happened that Haman built a thing to hang Mordecai the same night? Like, anyway. Got to keep going. The second banquet happens the next night, and it's at that banquet that Esther reveals Haman's plot. And then Esther tells the king she's a Jew, and it's her people that are going to be killed. And the king becomes furious with Haman, and in his fury he leaves, right? And the moment that he leaves, because he's so angry, Haman starts to beg the queen for mercy, right? The king happens to come back in the room, and somehow the positioning and what it looked like to him was that Haman was like trying to come on to his queen, so that made him even more mad, right? And he declares Haman to be hanged. Where do you think they're going to hang Haman? Shannon, where are they going to hang him? Yeah, on the thing he built himself. It's just, it's great, okay? So, anyway, the story wraps up with, okay, so Haman dies. The king knows about this awful plot, right? He gives Esther the house of Haman, which is like, you know, all the things that Haman was in charge of and owned. The edict to assassinate the Jews couldn't be revoked. Like, he couldn't just say, we're not doing this anymore, because of the way the laws were at the time. But they could write a new edict. So what he did was he wrote a new law that said the Jews could defend themselves on the day they were supposed to be killed. So that day comes, the Jews completely destroy their enemies. Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews declared a holiday feast to celebrate their deliverance, and this is actually kind of a remembrance thing. You can dig into that if you want to. Then Mordecai became second in rank to the king. So he kind of took Haman's slot. Okay? So it's like all this crazy stuff happens, and all these events are happening, and it never said God anywhere. I mean, they fasted, but fasting can be things other than praying, and never said who they were praying to. But Esther, in a moment of courage, saved her whole nation. Right? Because she decided to tell the king, because she decided to ask the king if she could talk to him, the Jews were spared. And I think Esther, before that, was inspired by Mordecai's faith. God's hand put him there in her life to act upon the things she was going through. It's like this domino effect. And then if you think about the Jewish people, right, one of the descendants of all these people was Mary, the mother of Jesus. I mean, this whole line of people, all these characters, all these people, right, they all fit in this. And sometimes we can get overwhelmed with, like, why does this matter, and why do they matter, and hundreds of years and this and that. But one of my greatest joys in reading the Bible has become that, like, big aha moment of, wow, like, this really does all fit together. So this little book in the middle of all these Old Testament things, it's a lot. But again, you can kind of see all these events that just happen and happen and happen, and when you get through it, you can be like, oh, God was there. God was there. God was there, right? And it's so hard for us in the moment to trust that. But again, God gives us these stories as a reminder of that. Like he really is. So I would encourage you to reread this book, like on your own. I kind of like went really fast through it, but it's such a cool story. But to end us up here, here's just a few points on the end of your map to sort of sum up some things I thought about the book. Ordinary days can become extraordinary. Lots of little events happen in this book that are like ordinary things, but really God uses them in big ways. Some of our days can seem very mundane, right? But they all have parts that are important. I mean, I think about the day that like the rain started for the flood with Noah. Like that one day, a lot happened, right? The day that the burning bush spoke to Moses. Like ordinary days can become extraordinary. Next point, God wants you to play a part in his story. This is a part where this might be like reverse thinking for you. It isn't your story. It's his story. And he wants you to be in it. It's not like you're saying, okay, God, be part of my life. I mean, we do that. But really it's, okay, God, I'm going to be part of your life. I'm going to be part of your bigger story. And he wants you to play a part in it. So people always say, God has a wonderful plan for your life. And this is true. But an even better thought to that is that God loves his son Jesus and has a wonderful plan for Jesus. Because there's going to be a day when he's the Lord of everything. And he wants you to play a part with Jesus. He invites you into that. And he loves us enough to give us a place in it. And so when you think, when you fret or think about like, oh, what's God's plan for my life? Well, number one, it's be in his story, right? Be involved in what Jesus is doing. Last point, faith is shown through humility. Okay? I see Esther as a hero of faith because she remained humble. Even when she was in the palace and had everything, she put others above herself. She could have let fear take over. She could have said like, hey, like I was an orphan. I had nothing. Now I'm the queen and I'm in the palace. I have everything. I don't care about you people. She could have done that. She could have hidden. She could have not revealed the fact that she was a Jew. Okay? But she put herself aside and let God be the main character, right? And that reminds me again, it sounds like Jesus. He came down from his palace, right? From his perfect place, perfect unity with his Father. He came down into our mess and lived a perfect life among all this sick, disgusting, disturbing, sinful junk that was happening at the beginning of this story. He lived that with us. He was a victim, just like Esther, right? You think about someone who's a victim. Jesus. And he did that for us, and he did that for you. So if you don't know that sense of belonging to him, that's been one of my prayers with this story, is that you kind of realize like, wow, I need to be part of this. So ask for humility, right? Because I think it's only in being humble that we can allow Jesus to work through those things in our lives. And you never know when you might be in a situation like Esther, where you have an opportunity to give something of yourself to save other people.